All right, everyone, get ready, because we're about to explore something pretty amazing, how the gut can actually impact stroke care. It might sound surprising, but what if I told you almost half of stroke patients experience gut issues after a stroke? And here's something even wilder sometimes. Bacteria that are normally found in the gut can actually end up in the lungs of these patients. It's kind of crazy, right?
It really is intriguing, and even more importantly, it's not just some random observation. There's actually a growing body of research showing a strong connection between the gut and the brain. And this connection is particularly significant when we're talking about stroke.
Absolutely, and that's exactly what we're going to unravel today. We're going to be taking a close look at two studies from 2024. One is called Gut Microbiota, Bacterial Translocation and Stroke, Current Knowledge and Future Directions, and it's from the journal Biomedicines. The other study is Intersecting Pathways, the role of metabolic dysregulation, gastrointestinal microbiome, and inflammation in acute ischemic stroke pathogenesis and outcomes for the Clin Med Journal. Our aim is to distill the most practical and relevant insights from these studies for you.
Exactly. The goal is to equip you with actionable information that you can actually use in your practice when you're managing stroke patients.
So let's jump right in. Let's start with what actually happens in the gut after a stroke. Research is showing a pretty clear pattern of something called gut dysbiosis. Could you break that down for us?
Well, gut dysbiosis basically refers to an imbalance in the microbial ecosystem of the gut. And it's not just some abstract concept either. About 50% of stroke patients report having real, tangible gastrointestinal symptoms. And that's a really significant clinical red flag.
So this is more than just a little bit of discomfort. We're talking about a significant number of patients experiencing real gut problems after a stroke. What's actually going on at the microbial level?
It seems that a stroke triggers a shift in the composition of the gut microbiota, and this mainly affects the two most dominant phyla of bacteria in the gut, Firmicutes and Bacteroidetes. Research indicates that there's often an increase in certain types of bacteria from the Firmicutes phylum, specifically genera like Streptococcus, Lactobacillus, and Prevotella, especially after an ischemic stroke.
Interesting. So if we see these specific bacteria increasing in our patients after they've had a stroke, should we consider that a warning sign?
It's definitely something to pay attention to, but it's important to remember that the research isn't completely conclusive yet. Some studies suggest that there's an increase in the Proteobacteria phylum instead. And this just goes to show how complex this relationship really is. Another area that needs more research is the impact of stroke on microbial diversity.
Right, you're talking about autodiversity and biodiversity. Those measures of diversity within and between samples of gut bacteria. I know there have been some conflicting findings in the research on this. Some studies show a decrease in diversity after stroke, while others actually show an increase. Why is this so difficult to figure out, and what does it mean clinically?
Well, these conflicting results suggest that the way stroke impacts the gut ecosystem is more nuanced than we initially thought. It might not be as simple as saying more diversity is good, less diversity is bad. There are probably many factors at play here, things like the type and severity of the stroke, the patient's age and overall health, and even their diet before the stroke could all have an impact.
So we need to think beyond just whether a certain bacteria are present or absent, and consider the bigger picture of the gut ecosystem as a whole. That makes sense. But how does all of this actually affect our patients? Why should we as clinicians be concerned about gut dysbiosis after a stroke?
This is where things get really interesting and maybe a little bit unsettling. When the gut's balance is disrupted, it can actually become leaky. This means that the intestinal barrier, which normally keeps things contained within the gut, becomes compromised.
Leaky gut, I've heard that term before, but mostly in conversations about general health and wellness. How does it specifically relate to stroke patients?
In stroke patients, a leaky gut becomes a serious problem because it allows bacteria to escape from the gut and travel to other organs through the bloodstream. This is called bacterial translocation.
So these gut bacteria are essentially going rogue and potentially causing a whole cascade of complications. Are there studies that show this actually happening in stroke patients?
Absolutely. There's a study from 2016 by Krapser and colleagues that looked at this in both young and old mice after they had a stroke. They found evidence of bacteria moving from the gut to other areas, including the lungs. And this is especially concerning in older patients because they often have a weaker gut barrier to begin with.
That makes sense. Clinically, we know that older stroke patients are more vulnerable to secondary infections, particularly respiratory infections. Could this translocation of gut bacteria be part of the reason why?
It's definitely a plausible explanation, and research seems to back up this connection. Studies have shown that age-related dysfunction of the gut barrier is linked to an increase in bacterial translocation. And this, in turn, increases the risk of infections after a stroke.
So we've been talking mostly about ischemic stroke. Is there a connection between gut health and hemorrhagic stroke as well?
There is definitely a connection, though the research on this is not as extensive as it is for ischemic stroke. A 2024 study by Cheng and their team showed that hemorrhagic stroke in mice can cause rapid damage and dysfunction to the lining of the gut. And this affects how well the intestines move things along.
That's a pretty big deal. So even though the underlying mechanisms might be different, it's clear that gut health is relevant in both types of stroke.
Absolutely. Another 2024 study, this one by Wang and colleagues, looked at changes in gut microbiota in patients who had an intracerebral hemorrhage. They found that there were dynamic shifts in the composition of the gut bacteria. This provides further evidence of the complex interplay between hemorrhagic stroke and gut health.
Okay, so we're seeing a clear pattern here. Both ischemic and hemorrhagic stroke can disrupt the gut. But what's at the root of this connection? Why is the gut so susceptible to problems after a stroke?
One of the key factors is metabolic dysregulation. Think about conditions like obesity, insulin resistance, and dyslipidemia. These are all major risk factors for stroke, and they also contribute to a state of inflammation throughout the body, including in the gut.
So we're essentially talking about the classic metabolic syndrome, right? But how does that specifically relate to gut health and stroke?
Adipokines are really important here. These are bioactive cytokines that are released by fat tissue. They have complex effects on systemic inflammation and how well the endothelium functions. In people with obesity, the production of these adipokines is dysregulated, and this contributes to a pro-inflammatory state, and this can increase the risk of stroke.
So the fat cells themselves are sending out inflammatory signals, and this messes with the gut and ultimately increases the risk of stroke. Are there any specific adipokines that clinicians should be paying attention to?
Leptin is a big one. It's involved in regulating energy balance, but it also has strong pro-inflammatory effects. When leptin levels are elevated, which is common in obesity, it's linked to more inflammation, higher blood pressure, and even the development of atherosclerosis.
Leptin, definitely something to keep on the radar. And what about the gut itself? How does it contribute to this whole inflammatory cascade?
Remember LPS, lipopolysaccharide. It's a component of the outer membrane of some bacteria, and it can trigger a powerful inflammatory response if it gets into the bloodstream.
Ah, right. LPS is like the alarm bell that sets off the immune system.
Exactly. And when there's gut dysbiosis, you have more LPS leaking into the bloodstream through that compromised gut barrier. This activates TLR4, or toll-like receptor 4, on immune cells, which ramps up the inflammation even more and contributes to the development of acute ischemic stroke.
Okay, so LPS is like the match that starts the fire, and TLR4 is the gasoline that makes it spread. But I also remember reading about HIF1. How does that fit into all of this?
HIF1, or hypoxia-inducible factor 1 alpha, is another piece of this complex puzzle. Obesity can create low oxygen conditions in tissues, and this activates HIF1A. This then leads to the expression of genes that are involved in inflammation and cell death, which further complicates things.
Wow, it's incredible how interconnected all these different systems are. It's like a domino effect: obesity, gut dysbiosis, inflammation, and then finally stroke. And it's not just inflammation that we're dealing with, right? Oxidative stress also plays a role in this gut-brain connection.
You're absolutely right. Think of oxidative stress as a fire that's burning inside the body. When there's an imbalance between the production of reactive oxygen species, or ROS, and the body's defenses against them, cells start to get damaged. And the brain is unfortunately very vulnerable to this type of damage.
Why is the brain so susceptible to oxidative stress?
It's because of a few factors. The brain has a high lipid content, which is easily oxidized. It has relatively low antioxidant activity, and it needs a lot of oxygen to function. All of this makes it a prime target for damage from ROS.
So the brain is sensitive to ROS. But how does this all tie back to the gut?
Well, it turns out that gut dysbiosis can actually contribute to increased oxidative stress throughout the entire body.
So not only does a disrupted gut release inflammatory molecules like LPS, but it also adds fuel to the fire of oxidative stress. This is starting to feel a little overwhelming.
I know it's a lot to take in, but it really emphasizes how important it is to have a holistic approach to preventing and managing stroke, addressing metabolic dysregulation, promoting a healthy gut, and managing oxidative stress should all be considered along with the traditional stroke care strategies.
This has been incredibly informative. But before we move on to what clinicians can actually do with all this information, I think we need a quick recap.
I agree. All right, so we've gone through some pretty complex science here, but now the question is, what can we actually do with this knowledge? As clinicians, how can we use these insights to actually help our stroke patients?
Let's get down to strategy. What are some concrete steps we can take?
Well, dietary intervention is a powerful tool that we can use right away.
So what's the ideal stroke diet? Is there some kind of magic bullet when it comes to food?
Unfortunately, there's no one-size-fits-all solution, no magic bullet. But fiber stands out as a really crucial factor in supporting a healthy gut. It might seem basic, but getting enough fiber is absolutely essential for maintaining a balanced gut microbiome.
I see what you mean. But I'm curious, how does fiber actually translate into real benefits for stroke patients? We all know that it's important for digestion, but how does it play a role in stroke recovery or even preventing stroke in the first place?
Well, here's how it works. When we eat fiber, the good bacteria in our gut ferment it, and this process produces short-chain fatty acids, or SCFAs. These SCFAs, especially one called butyrate, have really remarkable anti-inflammatory effects. They also help to strengthen the intestinal barrier, which reduces the risk of that leaky gut issue we were talking about earlier.
That makes perfect sense. So the fiber feeds the good bacteria, and then those bacteria create these protective SCFAs. Are there any specific types of fiber that are better than others? Or any recommended amounts that clinicians should be advising their patients to consume?
Variety is key when it comes to fiber. It's really important to encourage patients to get a mix of both soluble and insoluble fiber. Good sources include things like fruits, vegetables, whole grains, and legumes. For more personalized recommendations, a registered dietitian can be a great resource. They can provide really tailored guidance based on the individual patient's needs.
I completely agree. Personalized nutrition is so important. Switching gears a little bit, I'm remembering that research on TMAO, trimethylamine and oxide. Could you remind us about that and what it means for stroke?
Of course. TMAO is a metabolite that's produced by gut bacteria when they break down certain compounds that are found in foods like red meat. And studies have shown that when TMAO levels are elevated, it's linked to a higher risk of atherosclerosis and stroke.
So it seems like reducing the intake of foods that are high in those compounds that contribute to TMAO production, things like choline, lecithin, and L-carnitine. That could be beneficial for stroke patients, right?
That's the current thinking, yes. More research is always needed, of course. But it aligns with the general recommendation to focus on a plant-rich diet for overall health. And, as we're learning, for gut health specifically.
Beyond diet, are there any other promising interventions on the horizon for managing gut health in stroke patients?
There are definitely some exciting possibilities emerging, but it's important to remember that more research is needed to really confirm how effective they are in clinical settings.
I'm all ears. What are some of these cutting-edge approaches?
One that's getting a lot of attention is fecal microbiota transplantation, or FMT. This involves taking stool from a healthy donor and transferring it to a patient. The idea is to repopulate the patient's gut with beneficial bacteria. FMT has shown promise in treating other gut conditions, and research is now starting to explore its potential in stroke.
FMT for stroke. That's fascinating. What's the research showing so far?
Well, studies in animals have shown that FMT can actually improve outcomes after stroke. It seems to work by stimulating the growth of beneficial bacteria, and it also increases the production of anti-inflammatory compounds like IL-10, and it enhances the activity of regulatory T cells, which help to keep the immune system in check.
So FMT could potentially help restore a healthy gut ecosystem after stroke. That's amazing. Are there any other innovative therapies that are being explored?
Stem cell transplantation is another area of active research. The goal with this approach is to use stem cells to actually repair the damaged intestinal barrier. It's a way to directly address that leaky gut issue and prevent bacteria from escaping into the bloodstream.
Wow, using stem cells to repair the lining of the gut. That's incredible. Are there any studies that support this approach?
The research is still in its early stages, but there's a study from 2018 by Manny and colleagues. They found that transplanting intestinal epithelial stem cells into mice actually helped to protect against gut permeability, and it also reduced levels of LPS and IL-17 after stroke.
That's really encouraging. Are there any other promising avenues being investigated?
Researchers are also looking into using specific drugs to target inflammation more precisely, but this is still very much in its early stages. The challenge here is finding the right balance. We need to be able to effectively modulate the inflammatory response without weakening the immune system's ability to protect the body.
It's all about finding that sweet spot. We've covered a lot of ground here, from dietary changes to some really cutting-edge therapies. What are the key takeaways that you want our listeners to remember?
I think the most important message is that gut health is a fundamental part of stroke care. Gut dysbiosis and bacterial translocation can have a huge impact on how well a patient recovers from a stroke, and they can also increase the risk of complications.
So we need to start thinking beyond just the brain and recognize that the gut is a crucial part of the picture. It's all connected.
Exactly. Clinicians need to be incorporating gut health into their overall approach to stroke care. That includes prevention, treatment, and long-term management.
That's a really important point. What are some specific gut-related assessments or interventions that you personally find helpful in your practice? Do you routinely ask your patients about gastrointestinal symptoms? Do you screen for dysbiosis? Do you include recommendations about fiber in your dietary counseling?
Those are all excellent questions. Every clinician needs to consider those things and figure out what works best for them and their patients. It's about tailoring our approach to each individual person. And here's another question to think about. What questions does all of this research raise for you in your own practice?
That's a great point. This whole discussion has definitely sparked a lot of questions for me.
That's what it's all about, continual learning and questioning. That's how we stay at the forefront of patient care.
As we wrap up, I want to circle back to something we touched on earlier, the idea of personalized stroke care, and how this research really empowers us to tailor our approach to each individual patient.
Absolutely, that's a crucial takeaway. We're moving away from this one-size-fits-all model and starting to really consider each patient's unique gut profile and their metabolic state.
It's amazing to see how much this field is evolving. We're not just treating the stroke itself anymore. We're recognizing that each patient's gut microbiome is different. Their metabolic health is different. Their genetic predispositions are different. And all of these factors come together to influence their risk of stroke and how they recover.
And that's where clinicians play such a vital role. You're the ones who can see the whole picture, connect the dots, and develop a truly individualized treatment plan for each patient.
It's like being a detective, right? We gather clues from their medical history, their lifestyle, their lab results, and we piece together a story about their gut health and how that might be impacting their stroke.
Exactly. And based on those clues, we can then tailor our interventions, whether that's recommending dietary modifications, suggesting prebiotic or probiotic support, or even considering those cutting-edge therapies like FMT or stem cell transplantation as they become more widely available.
It's exciting stuff, but I'm also thinking about the challenges that clinicians might face when they're trying to integrate this gut-focused approach into their everyday practice.
Well, one challenge is that the research on gut health, especially in relation to stroke, is still relatively new. There are still gaps in our knowledge. And it can be difficult to translate those research findings into practical guidelines that clinicians can use in their practice.
So bridging that gap between the research and the clinical world is an ongoing process. What other obstacles do you see?
Access to specialized testing can be a barrier. If you want to analyze the gut microbiome, you need specific labs and techniques, and those might not be readily available to every clinician. And then there's the issue of cost. Insurance coverage for these tests can be a major hurdle for a lot of patients.
That's a really good point. Not everyone has the financial resources for that kind of testing. And let's not forget about the ever-present issue of time constraints. Clinicians are already so busy, and adding a thorough assessment of a patient's gut health can feel like just one more thing on their already overflowing plate.
That's true. But I'm optimistic that as the research progresses and the technology improves, these challenges will become less daunting. What seems cutting edge and difficult today could be standard practice tomorrow.
And clinicians are known for their commitment to staying up to date and finding ways to improve patient care.
Absolutely. Clinicians are incredibly adaptable, and I have no doubt they'll rise to the occasion as this field continues to advance.
So, to our listeners, as you grapple with this complex world of gut health and stroke, what's the one message you want them to leave with today?
Here's the key takeaway. When it comes to stroke, what happens in the gut doesn't just stay in the gut, it affects everything.
That's such a powerful statement. It reminds us to think beyond the obvious and to always consider the gut-brain connection in our approach to stroke care.
Keep asking questions. We're always here to help you explore the latest research and figure out how to apply it in your practice.
And don't forget to check out the show notes. You'll find a full disclaimer and a bibliography of all the research we talked about today. Until next time, keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep those guts healthy.
Disclaimer and bibliography in the description.